Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of October Nights. Going to do another author's reading here. October Nights, 31 Tales for the Halloween Season by me, available on Amazon in print or Kindle. Link is in the description box below. Now, there's some creepiness going on up here at the family campground tonight, so get my six. Because potentially, remember, the blue rectangle means potentially something's there. If we use a red circle, that means definitely something's there. But I've got my Bigfoot Sasquatch cat, Cleopatra, up here with me, and she's on edge. She's staring out there looking for something. And while I was setting the camera up here on the tripod, I heard what sounded like footsteps running straight at me from above the hill. And they were getting so close, so fast, I turned around with my fist drawn, ready to punch. I felt like somebody's coming at me. Brah, as they say these days. I think bro was like before 2010. After that, it's brah. And so anyway, turn around, nothing there. Cleopatra is like pacing and staring off into the nether world here. So keep your eyes open for what we may or may not see. Listen for what we may or may not hear. As I read the story, okay? Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different. You know, these stories, when I read these videos don't get nearly the views that some of our other content gets, but I'm doing it anyway because I know that times are tough right now. We're going through COVID-19, the pandemic, the quarantines, and a lot of people have had a loss of income. You know, this thing's $14.99 in print, and I think it's $6.99 in Kindle, and that's in the U.S. And if you know, we've got friends in Tasmania, Small Wanda, I think, shout out. We're sorry that the prices are so high there, but it's because it's an imported product halfway around the world. I'm reading this, even though fewer people are watching these videos, because if you can't afford to buy this right now, I want you to at least hear some of the stories. Now, and with that said, I want to do two things. You know, a lot of folks watching this have been affected literally by COVID-19, by the virus. I want to wish everyone who is currently suffering from COVID-19 well wishes. I hope, I pray for you and your recovery, okay? There are a lot of folks who are recovering from it. If you have it, we hope that you end up in that category, okay? All of you, no matter who you are, okay? Okay, and then number two, I'm actually going to dedicate tonight's reading to a couple of ladies who actually confirmed to me that this is worth doing despite lower views. I don't care. Going to give a shout out to, it's a pileated woodpecker, but keep listening. You never know what we might hear next. And what's that white thing back there? That's a piece of wood. This thing right here, that's a piece of firewood. The way it's angled, I guess, and the way the sun's hitting it, it looks white. Shout out to Susan McCutcheon, who left this comment. And these comments were left here on the channel, so these are public comments. I'm not giving away any information here that these two ladies obviously didn't care to make public themselves. Susan McCutcheon, she said she lives on only $1,000 a month. Despite that, she still tithes. She said, I can't afford to buy your so reasonably priced books. God always provides. Well, maybe God is providing for Susan McCutcheon here to hear these stories that she can't afford, you know, coming from a book that she can't afford to buy by me telling the story, reading it here in a video. And then Lori Monco, big shout out, well wishes, thoughts, prayers going up to Lori. She says she's struggling with cancer and she loves our channel. She loves my channel. She loves my wife's channel, Life with Dearly, because she gets to have her own little adventure without leaving her living room. So, you know, if only two of you watch this and you're, you know, and it makes you feel better, this is worth doing, okay? So I'm going to do it as much as I can throughout the month of October. Again, we intentionally keep the channel PG rated. The books are not. I don't write children's literature. I write adult fiction. There are some stories in here that have adult themes, adult content, and adult language. Be aware of that if you do purchase any of my books. And the Bigfoot Sasquatch Files, loaded with that stuff. Okay, there are some bad words in this story tonight, but I will change them as I read it. Okay, And for tonight's story, I'm going to do something different as well. I'm going to actually read the disclaimer at the beginning of the book. Okay? Some guy commented yesterday. He said, "You're probably not going to acknowledge this, but your humor is top shelf. Andy Kaufman had nothing on you." I'm sorry I forget your name, but sir, I just did acknowledge that. And what I can tell you is Andy Kaufman was one of my favorite comedians. Let me read this disclaimer. This is a work of fiction. All places, events, and characters appearing in this work are products of the author's imagination. Anyone who feels as if they are being represented by any of the characters, events, or locations in this work is merely suffering from a guilty conscience. Kaufman, is she like, no? As my beautiful bride, dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say, no? She has me doing it. Okay, so this story tonight for October 2, this is kind of a new twist on an old tale I've been working on off and on through the years. It's called, whatever that says. I can read upside down and backwards, but not through a phone. It's called You'd Better Not Take More Than One. Okay? So, with no further ado, because it probably is a 20-minute read, I hope you enjoy this. Hope you've got your flannel. Hope you've got your campfire. And if not, I hope you're enjoying mine, okay? You better not take more than one. And guys, there is yellow goldenrod all around me. You can't see it, but it is... Think I'm lying? Hold on. This is my nemesis in the fall. It's my favorite time of year, and it's a beautiful flower, as you can see. But it's all over the meadows, and the pollen from this stuff is just wreaks havoc on me. So you'll have to excuse me if I'm doing that. Okay, you'd better not take more than one. Get my 6. No one knew where he'd gotten it from. This sense of entitlement combined with greed, and it's not like he was materialistic or showy. He was neither. Despite all the stuff he'd acquired at other people's expenses through sheer trickery, deceit, dishonesty, and downright criminal fraud at times, you could drive past David's house or see him on the street and you'd think the man didn't have a pot to blank in. His parents had been hard workers, farmers, and this was back when farmers in America were actually the ones out doing the farming, getting their hands dirty, not using fancy machinery, or other various sorts of labor to do the planting and the harvesting for them. Okay. Trust me, there's just a reason I skipped that part. It's good, but, just... we'll be able to get through this one. Hang in there. I'm making sure it's PG rated, okay? So David had... there was too much Andy Kaufman-ishy humor right there in that paragraph, and it just... People are very sensitive these days, so I skipped that part. Okay. So David had good examples through both his mother and father set for him. And he had 3 siblings, a sister and 2 brothers, who all worked for everything they'd ever had and who never thought that the system or anyone in it owed them anything. Oh, but David, what a piece of work he was. Back in school, he'd always cheat. He'd bully people into doing any of his projects, and if they didn't take their tests with their papers positioned just so at the extreme sides of their desks so he could copy their answers, they'd be likely to walk into school the next day with a shiner. That means black eye for any millennials reading this. Kaufman. And as he aged, it was more of the same, just to greater degrees. David had managed to get a labor job with the grounds workers at the college in the next town over right after high school. He kept it dang near a year before he was able to convince the Department of Social Security that he'd torn up his lower back doing something or other while on the job. They hadn't known to ask him about his pre-existing condition, the result of a sudden fall he'd taken one Halloween night, half a dozen years before, while in middle school, from which he'd never fully recovered. The fall had hurt him badly, but not to the degree of making him permanently disabled as far as earning a living goes. He could have worked plenty of office jobs and never had a problem, but what's the fun in that? Not the office part, the whole working in general part. So he pulled his best Charlton Heston That was a famous actor a long time ago, in case you're a millennial. And he got SSID approval, which, of course, got him a tax-free monthly check for life. And now that he had income for life, he had the time he no longer wasted going to work. Time he now used to scheme. And that's what he did. And he started with his own relatives. David had an aged aunt and uncle who lived up the road from him, both in their 80s, and both of them barely able to get around outside their home. Neither of them could drive safely anymore, and everyone else in the family griped and moaned and came up with a million different places they had to be on the days they needed to head into town to get groceries or go to the doctor. Insert David, appearing to be their knight in shining armor, but who was really just the devil in disguise. David volunteered to be their chauffeur, their lawn care guy, as long as no one was looking. That, bad word, sister of his had turned him in for Social Security fraud already by this time, and he couldn't risk that mess happening again by being seen doing manual labor without pain or difficulty. And of course, he would put himself in charge of the old couple's finances. Their adult children, living 3 states away, were somewhat happy that Mom and Pop were being looked after, but since it was David and they knew his ways, they were a bit worrisome. Not enough to move 3 states over and do the job themselves, mind you. They had their own lives, so they hoped for the best but prepared themselves for the worst. And it was really to no surprise to them when Mom and Pop passed and David, who conveniently had written himself in as their power of attorney, was awarded their house and property and the few $100,000 they had in the bank. Oh, they made a half-feeble attempt to fight it, but the judge said that David's name was on the POA, so there was nothing they could do. Having been recipients of a few shiners, remember kids, that's a black eye, courtesy of Cousin Dave, back in the day, they chose to let it go. This windfall of sorts, the money and assets, David was able to steal from his cousins, having had the time to do so by stealing a steady paycheck from the taxpayers, allowed him to up his game. Now he could walk into any bank, and with plenty of cash and a new house, which he was using as a rental property, he could start getting personal loans and mortgages to buy more rental properties. And he devised a scheme to do so and never make any payments on the mortgages, or at least not very many and with no regularity. Yes, David had now figured out how to commit mortgage fraud. After acquiring another rental property, David made the first 3 payments, but then he contacted his lender and told them that due to financial hardship, he would not be able to pay the mortgage of the property in question. The millennial on the other end of the line asked no probing questions. He simply took David's info down while watching a compilation of memes, videos on YouTube on his smartphone at the same time. Those millennials are really good at multitasking. And thus, David had to make no payments on that mortgage for the next 6 months. After 6 months of making no mortgage payments, the lender called and let David know that they were going to do a mortgage readjustment, by where they would allow him to start making his mortgage payments all over from the beginning, and that they'd lower his payments somehow so he'd have no difficulties making them. It was a Hail Mary of sorts, instituted by Congress after the mortgage crisis of 2008, thus allowing customers to pretty much rob mortgage companies the way mortgage companies had been stealing real estate from customers before the crisis, by knowingly approving mortgages for people they knew would never be able to make the payments, and then foreclosing on them and then selling their properties. The real estate market had been booming back then, so the mortgage companies saw it as easy pickings. And when it didn't work out for them, that was okay because the government bailed them out, and that was great, until this new law passed. And the conniving, cheating, lying, and scamming Davids of the world have been robbing them for free houses ever since. "Send y'all's appraisers," he said, defiance in his voice, already contemplating his diabolical plan to hold the process up even longer, as he still hadn't rented the property. "Sons of B-words," he said, making his way out the back door to his outbuilding. He knew exactly what he was going to do, and he was headed out to grab the industrial-grade steel chainsaw valued at about $1,000 that he'd stolen from the Department of Transportation people when they'd come through last time clearing the power lines right of way in front of his house. Hey, he told himself as he picked it up, making sure that snitch B-word of a sister of his wasn't anywhere around. If they're dumb enough to leave their, bad word, laying around while they head to their trucks for lunch, they deserve it. He'd made sure to conveniently not be home when they came by after lunch to ask if he'd seen it, and heck, since it was government property, they never came back to question him again. He was sure old Uncle Sugar was more than happy to buy them a new one. Chalk another one right up the backside of the taxpayer by way of good old boy Dave. He'd never admit it aloud to anyone, but David had to admit to himself on his way up to his rental property that wouldn't rent that part of his plan hadn't worked. Sure, he'd planned on scamming the mortgage company out of quite a few payments, but he hadn't wanted to make the payments he had wanted to make the payments every other year or so for the sake of keeping his credit score high enough to be able to go out and get more loans to not make payments on quickly sooner after. The house wouldn't rent because too many people knew too much about it, like the fact that the last 3 families who'd lived in it had had at least one family member die in it. Not a good track record for a house. There was a name for houses like that. People referred to such houses as haunted houses, and it was bad for business if you owned one and was trying to rent it. What was even creepier, if you were to ask David, was its history before the multiple family deaths. Specifically, who'd lived in it before it had been bought by someone who lost a child in it, and then rented it out after that to 2 more families, both of whom would lose a child in it, before being sold, with good riddance, to David. The witch. Stay away from the witch's house, his parents would bark at him on his way out the door every Halloween when he'd been a child, way back in the 1950s. They didn't need to tell him because he and every other kid in the small farming community already knew to stay away from the witch's house. They'd all seen her at one point or another. She was bent over, walked with a cane, and she wore a tall black hat and everything. She looked just like a witch should, down to the hairy mole on the side of her face. And the strangest thing about her was that even though she was every bit of 80 years old, back when David was a kid, was that everyone's parents remembered her as being every bit of 80 years old when they'd been kids as well. It was the last year that David had gone trick-or-treating. He'd been in 6th grade, and since he'd been big for his age and already a bully, most of the kids assumed he wasn't afraid of anything. This, of course, back during the time in life when no one really realizes that bullies are afraid of everything. It's why they're bullies. But when the other kids dared David to go to the witch's house for candy, cowering over in fear of the upcoming Shiner, which never came, and I don't need to remind you millennials what this is again, do I? He wasn't about to reveal to them at their young age, and his, that he really was terrified of everything, and that was why he spent so much time beating people up, so they wouldn't notice. So he put on his best Heston face, and that's not from the goldenrod, that's to remind the millennials who Charlton Heston was, and marched right up to that old B-word's door, and as he always referred to her, and knocked. There were at least half a dozen kids hiding behind the privet hedges 30 yards from the witch's front door, all excited and curious, and not a single one of them made a single sound. As soon as David had finished knocking, it was as if God was up there in the sky and he'd pressed the mute button on planet Earth. There were no sounds, though it was a warm October night, and they were in the South. There were no frogs, no crickets, no owls, no nothing. And then the floorboards on the other side of the door creaked. David felt sweat drip from his hairline. It ran down across his forehead and burned when it went into his left eye. He'd been too frozen in fear to wipe it away before it went into his eye. But now that his eye was burning, David reached up to wipe it just as the witch opened the door holding a dish of individually wrapped candies. "Aren't you supposed to say something?" the witch said, as David simply stood and stared at her. He was in complete disbelief that he was face to face with, and only 2 feet away from, the old witch. The only people who were in near equal shock were all the kids hiding behind the privet bushes. "Trick or treat," David said, barely able to get it out. "Let's go with treat," the old witch said. "Let's go with treat," the old witch said, raising the bowl a bit so the movement of her doing so would grab David's attention and remind him where he was and of what he was doing. David looked down into the candy dish, and he reached in. Being that David was David, greedy little, bad word, even as a child, the thought of taking one and only one candy never occurred to him. Taking one of anything edible would never occur to him, and it's why in adulthood he'd push the scales to 300, even though he was 3 inches shy of 6 feet tall. He'd never seemed to care about the fact that gluttony and obesity kind of went hand in hand. The old witch said, teasing but serious. Take only one. David looked up at her, and his hand instinctively let loose of all the candy he'd grabbed. But then something happened. David felt fear, real fear, and he knew it. And the way the old witch smiled at the exact moment he'd felt it let him know that she knew it too. And man, did it tick him off. Let her F word you old rotten blank, explicit, censored, blah, 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 he said as he grabbed the whole dish of candy from her, jerked it hard, and then turned and ran off the porch. He'd made it halfway down her walk, at the end of which the other kids were now coming from behind the privet bush, in complete awe of what David had done when it happened. David would swear for years later that one of the stones of the walk actually raised up out of the ground, and not to toe level, but to halfway up his shin level, and it caused him to fall. The next day, he'd have a bruise on the front of his right shin where he'd claimed the stone had hit him, and a few of the kids, when threatened with a good old shiner, see 4 pages previous, paragraph 2 for the meaning if you've forgotten, you whippersnappers, would claim that they'd seen something too. Though in constant fear of being attacked as if by a wounded bear at any time, the kids rallied together and helped heft David home. He'd miss the whole next year of school, and the doctor would say he might never recover completely. It was those very words from the doctor that hatched David's plan of an SSID disability check even at such an early age. Bad word, David said to himself aloud as he turned up the short dirt road, or the long dirt drive, whichever you preferred to call it, that led to his unrented and unseemingly unrentable rental house. No one's scared of it. It's just a bad spot. Location, location, location. David parked his car, the one he'd not made a payment on in 2 months, despite having all that money in the bank, because the repo man only came after 90 days, at which time he'd hand him a check and call him off, just like last time, and walked up the porch steps, trying not to think of that Halloween night all those years ago. His plan to keep the appraisers away didn't require him to come all the way up to the house. He'd be using that old poplar tree about 200 yards back on the road for that, but he'd been so caught up in his thoughts of that night, despite his best efforts of trying not to think about it, that he'd driven right past the tree without even consciously seeing it. So he figured he'd take a peek through the windows to make sure everything was okay. When he reached the porch at the top of the steps, he felt his heart skip a beat, and then he felt a sudden rage at the sight of a dish of candy sitting on an old stool with a handwritten sign in the middle of the candy which read, "Take only one." "You sons of..." bad words, David wailed, as he already knew who'd done it. That little bad word of a man named Joshua, who he'd gone to school with all those years ago, was an appraiser, and David was convinced he'd been out ahead of him to play this little prank. "You've got a butt-whooping coming," he said, thinking of Joshua, as he bent over and collected the dish of candy. No need to waste it. It was food, after all. So he turned and took it back to the car with him, and turned around and drove down to the old poplar tree a couple 100 yards away. When he reached the tree, David got out of the car and pulled open the back hatch of the Subaru Forester and opened the hatch of the Subaru Forester, and he pulled out the chainsaw, all while gnawing on his already third piece of candy. He cranked the cord, and the saw started right up on the first pull, and he was thankful that the government never spared any expense when it came to spending the taxpayers' dollars on equipment. David looked up at the top of the tree before making his first cut. Most people, seeing the tree with its beautiful leaves of fall gold, leaves shaped like t-shirts, some people would say, and all those beautiful leaves blowing in the breeze, wouldn't cut a tree of this size, age, and splendor down if you paid them. It had weathered more than 200 years of drought and winter and flood and social discord from the Antish people who lived beneath it to become the towering giant that it was. But all David viewed it as being good for was to block the road so the appraiser couldn't make his way to the house to do his job. At least until they subcontracted someone to come out and remove the tree, because David sure as heck wasn't going to come out and move it. Why? Because he had a bad back and all. He figured he could easily miss another 6 months of mortgage payments by doing this. David had cut plenty of trees in his life, even though they could never prove he'd cut down the one that fell on his sister's double wide shortly after she'd reported him for the disability fraud. So he knew exactly how to do it. Pick the direction you want the tree to fall and make your first cut, a straight line going almost to the center of the tree. Then you simply walk around to the opposite side from there and start cutting out your wedge about a foot above the original cut on the other side. A freaking moron could do it, and David was proof. Just as David was finishing cutting his wedge, the huge monstrosity of a tree began falling across the road. David safely standing on the opposite side of its fall, but then it happened. Had anyone been around to witness it, and had they been under the direct threat of one of David's shiners, okay, we all know what those are by now, right? They might have said that they'd seen something too. What David saw, and it was the last thing, by the way, that he would ever see, was the freaking tree stop falling and simply be held by some unseen force, suspended in midair. And then he saw the adjustment. It all happened so fast, yet it seemed like it was in slow motion. Despite however fast it was happening in real time, David didn't have time to move out of the way as the trunk of the tree came flying straight back at him, knocking his head off upon contact, and then continuing its fall, burying the fat B word with more than 200 years old and 20 tons worth of yellow tulip poplar. The end. And to quote Washington Irving, I'm getting out of here.